In this Maximo Application Suite video, brought to you by Maven Asset Management, I want to discuss the recently added and updated MAS admin APIs. I thought this was a good time to go in depth on some of the different APIs available within the Maximo Application Suite. I plan to cover several key concepts related to authentication requirements for these APIs and then demonstrate each of the APIs, including the authentication. This information will be split into two parts. The first part will cover some general API information for the Maximo Application Suite, and then some key authentication and connectivity topics. The second will revolve around interacting with each of the APIs as a working demonstration. All right, let's jump in. So for our Maximo Application Suite API Roundup discussion, I did want to just mention from a disclaimer perspective, IBM has been doing a lot of very frequent releases and patches, and so the information outlined in this presentation and the systems being demoed are for MAS 8.11.5 and Mange 8.7.4. The intended audience for this presentation are technical administrators, developers, support team, or system integrators. Because we're going to cover a variety of different APIs today, I did want to just discuss the fact that I kind of see APIs having two types, and those two types are data and admin. And as far as data APIs, those deal with interactions with system data. So I think of manage with assets, locations, work orders, people, for example. And then admin APIs, I think about interactions with system operations or behavior. So I think about properties or maybe functionality that's being enabled or disabled. So as we get into these three APIs, the Manage REST API, the Manage Tools API, and the MAS Admin API, they really are tied to the different types of APIs. So the Manage REST API, I would classify as a data API, and then the Manage Tools and the MAS Admin are more admin type related APIs. The Manage REST API is the standard API that we've seen in older versions of Manage Maximo and its data API. The Manage Tools API is part of Manage, but it's mostly related to being able to get access to log files that would be no longer available due to the OpenShift architecture. And then the MAS Admin API, which was the original driver for this information, is related to managing the Maximo Application Suite core functionality. So things that are handled inside of the MAS core is what we're going to go ahead and focus on there. I did want to mention that all of these three APIs are JSON. Each of the three APIs that we are covering here are very powerful and enable streamlined or automated ways to perform functions that often must have been previously completed manually. For example, the Manage REST API allows you to work directly with the managed data, attachments, and system properties, allows you to execute automation scripts, interacting with the workflow engine, viewing server logs, and even executing saved queries. A few examples here could be displaying managed data in another system or application, or even allowing another system to change data in Manage. The Manage Tools API is exciting because it provides a standard and remotely accessible way of performing some critical functions with the Manage application inside of the OpenShift architecture. You're able to run Integrity Checker in report or repair mode, get tools logs or a list of tools logs, start and stop the Manage pods, or even upload logs to the S3 Cloud's object storage. These were things that were previously had to be performed by physically being on an administrative server hosting Maximo or Manage. This provides a lot of the same functionality in a standard API. The MAS Admin API is brand new for the application suite and provides a great opportunity to view and manage and update almost all configurations within the MAS core application. Looking at the API documentation from IBM, you can see that there's a long list of configuration options, including JDBC configuration, Kafka and Mongo configuration, storage configuration, as well as SMTP and single sign-on configuration. Additionally, user management configuration. Before we dive too deep into our API roundup, I did want to cover a few authentication concepts and terms because they're important for connecting through these three APIs. The first topic is obtaining an API key or password. And then we're going to talk about JSON web tokens. We're then going to hit on basic authentication and then cover just HTTP headers for API key X-access token for the managed and mass APIs. In order to obtain an API key in Manage, just like you used to, you would go to Integration, API Keys. From here, you have the option to add a new API key, select your user, hit OK, enter an optional expiration, and click Create. You can then copy this key, and it will be used back in Postman. To obtain an API key and password inside of the application suite, log in to the application suite, click on Administration, navigate to the API keys, go ahead and click Create API Key, provide some optional information, enter a duration if you'd like it to have an expiration, choose your access for the API key, click Submit. You'll now have an API key authentication token, which you will use for your integration. I'd like to cover basic authentication briefly with regards to the JSON web token. Basic authentication is an HTTP authentication mechanism that passes the username and password inside of a header, base64 encoded, username : password with the word basic in front and an authorization of key. This authorization or custom header is part of the API for the mass admin, for the mass admin API. This v1 authenticate URL is the only one that uses, is the only endpoint that uses the basic authentication. And so if you look here, we have inheriting from auth, but we have the mass admin, we have the authenticate authorization using the API key and API password that we got from mass admin console. So if we go to v1 authenticate and we pass in the basic authentication header and we hit send, it provides us with a JSON web token. This JSON web token ends up being used for all of the other all the other mass admin APIs. For the manage tools and manage REST APIs, they both use API keys for their authentication. So if you look here, we have API key as the key value. So the key is the API. API key is the key, and the value from manage is your value that you use for your key. And the same thing is used for the manage REST API. API key is the key, and then the API key value is used in the value field, and they're both passed in as headers. If we take a look at the mass admin API, you'll notice that its authorization is also API key, but the key is different. It wants you to pass in your JSON web token value as the value to go with your key of X-access token. So X-access token is the key required in the header for the mass admin APIs, while the tools APIs and the REST APIs are using a key value of API key. Thank you for joining for part 1 of our API Roundup series for Maximo Application Suite. I look forward to part 2, where I will demonstrate some examples of each of the APIs. See you soon.